There is a genre of fiction known as cosmic horror. Unlike most types of horror, this particular variant derives most of its impact from a sort of existential dread and disturbing revelations about the nature of the universe or the nature of oneself. Even so, most horror tales have a monster of some sort or another. In the case of cosmic horror, when the monster isn't reality itself, it tends to take on the form of a generally eldritch and unearthly creature. Tentacles and slime are common motifs, though the overall form tends to be something of a defiance or mockery of established natural laws. Part of the dread in such a creature is the realization that the laws of nature are not perhaps what we believed them to be. The familiar becomes uncanny and disturbingly wrong. Of course, such unthinkable monstrosities could never truly exist in reality. And yet, there are actual forms of life that might easily be considered as cousins to these impossible fictional abominations. In the stories, the monster might come from the benighted depths of outermost space, or perhaps another reality altogether. It may also arise from the uncharted depths of the brooding sea, waking from a slumber of untold aeons. On an admittedly smaller scale, many of the everyday eldritch creatures may also be found in the oceans of the world. Some forms, such as the cephalopods, are certainly unusual, and yet they are largely familiar to us. One may look an octopus in the eye and feel some distant affinity to even this alien intelligence. Other forms, like the cnidarians, also have a certain familiarity to them. That, and while their bodies are quite different to ours, they are also relatively simple and easy to make sense of. There is one group, though, that is quite unusual, with forms both varied and complex. They seem almost defined by their oddity, being quite different to even their immediate relatives. The more deeply one investigates these particular forms of life, the more they might seem to be creatures from another world. They even have tentacles. Yet, despite their presence throughout the world's oceans, and the scale of their often impressive populations, these creatures are generally overlooked. Perhaps this has to do with their rather humble way of life. This group contains no predators, and they are not particularly swift or agile, or even all that intelligent. As if in defiance of all of the expectations of a cosmic horror, they are simple detritivores, continually filtering and cleansing the waters and sediments of the seven seas. As far as formal classification is concerned, this particular group is one of the 5 classes found within the phylum Echinodermata. This phylum is odd enough to begin with, but these particular echinoderms are perhaps the strangest and most unconventional of their kind. Scientists refer to these creatures as holothuroids. More commonly, they are known by the rather unflattering name of sea cucumbers. Echinoderms are weird to begin with. The holothuroids in particular are stranger still. They stand apart from the other main groups. The very name echinoderm means spiny skin, but nearly all sea cucumbers are entirely lacking in spines. The closest approximation to such structures might be some of the soft, fleshy papillae that adorn certain species. That, or perhaps a few cases of armored scales. These are very much exceptions to the rule, though, as sea cucumbers are almost entirely soft-bodied. Most species have at least a few isolated ossicles in their body wall, though these appear to be leftovers from a possibly more armored ancestry. The only hardened part of any typical sea cucumber is the calcareous ring located inside the body around the throat. It serves as an anchor point for some of the creature's internal musculature. This includes a series of muscles that allow for the withdrawal and involution of the creature's feeding structure. Talking of this feeding structure, the holothroids possess an arrangement quite unlike that of any other echinoderm. There are no jaws or teeth like those seen in sea urchins or brittle stars. There is no eversible stomach akin to what many sea stars employ. Instead, there is a ring of tentacles surrounding the mouth. These tentacles are modified podia, or tube feet, and they vary considerably from species to species depending upon the feeding habits. As they are derived from the hydraulically driven tube feet, they themselves are also hydraulically operated. In other words, each tentacle consists of a muscular exterior surrounding a fluid-filled interior space. Fluid entry extends the tentacle, and muscular contraction retracts the tentacle. More precise muscular contractions against a relatively consistent internal pressure allow for a wide range of motion. While these feeding tentacles are found in all known sea cucumbers, most species also possess more conventional tube feet. These are typically arranged in 5 rows down the length of the body, though there are often a great many modifications to this basic pattern. At this point, it might be helpful to consider the overall body symmetry of the typical sea cucumber, as this will provide some context for the placement of the tube feet. In the more familiar echinoderms, like sea urchins and sea stars, the mouth is located on the underside of the body, while the other end of the digestive tract is somewhere near the top. The lower and upper surfaces are sometimes described as the oral and aboral surfaces, respectively. With sea cucumbers, this pattern has been stretched out and then flipped onto its side. Indeed, the easiest way to understand sea cucumber anatomy, relative to other echinoderms, may well be to begin with a sea urchin as a reference. This hypothetical sea urchin loses its spines and pedicellariae, though it retains the 5 rows of tube feet going up its sides. It stretches vertically until it is more cylindrical than spherical. The rigid internal skeleton fades away into scattered ossicles embedded in a now muscular body wall. The teeth and the complicated Aristotle's lantern degenerate into a simple internal calcareous ring. The whole creature then drops onto one side and sprouts a halo of tentacles about its mouth. Last of all, the 3 rows of tube feet now located on its underside remain as a collective locomotory surface known as the trivium. The 2 rows down the creature's back are either reduced or lost altogether, or modified into papillae. This dorsal region is known as the bivium. At this point, you more or less have a fairly typical sea cucumber. I should note that while this is a common overall pattern, there are many holothroid species that diverge from even this basic form. For example, the order Apodida consists of sea cucumbers that have entirely lost all of their tube feet, retaining only the feeding tentacles. These creatures look more like worms than echinoderms. The longest known species of sea cucumber, Synapta maculata, can be found within this order. It may grow up to 3 meters long, or roughly 10 feet. As strange as the exterior of a sea cucumber might be, there are a number of surprises to be found in the internal anatomy as well. For future reference, one should expect a pattern of an internal ring around the throat, connecting to 5 lines extending backward through the body wall. This is a basic pattern that is repeated for several different structures and systems. The other basic pattern to keep in mind is a bag with a tube running down the middle. The digestive tract is a coiling tube of varying complexity depending upon the species that winds its way through the interior of the body from one end to the other. The space between this gut and the outer body wall is known as the coelomic cavity and contains a fluid similar to seawater. As with other echinoderms, various types of cells known as coelomocytes patrol this space. Interestingly enough, many functions that are handled by dedicated organ systems in the vertebrate body are taken care of by these cells in echinoderms. Such cells have functions that include immune responses, healing processes, the delivery of nutrients throughout the body, and the collection and removal of waste chemicals. To return to the gut, there are significant structural associations at both the front and the back. The front of the gut is encircled by a combination of organs and tissues, sometimes referred to as the aquapharyngeal bulb. Within this bulb lies the calcareous ring, consisting of 10 rigid calcareous plates. These rigid structures serve as anchor points for 5 longitudinal bands of muscle that typically run the length of the sea cucumber's body. Much of the body wall consists of circular muscles that run perpendicular to these longitudinal muscles. There is also a nerve ring present in the bulb, which connects to radial nerves in a manner similar to that seen in other echinoderms. The water vascular system common to all echinoderms is also present here. The bulb contains a ring canal, which forms the central hub of this system, and connects to radial canals extending backward through the body wall. As with other echinoderms, the water vascular system connects directly to the tube feet. In sea cucumbers, it also connects to the hollow feeding tentacles. One or more sacs, known as Polian vesicles, extend into the coelomic cavity from the water ring. These structures appear to have roles in immunity and the generation of coelomocytes. In most echinoderms, the water vascular system connects to the outside seawater through a sieve plate known as the madrioporite. This is not quite the case in sea cucumbers, though. There is still a madrioporite and a stone canal that connects it to the ring canal. However, this structure is entirely internalized, hanging suspended within the coelomic cavity. The water vascular system in sea cucumbers utilizes coelomic fluid rather than filtered seawater. In addition to the water vascular system, the sea cucumbers possess a relatively well-developed circulatory system, sometimes called a hemal system. This system can also be found in other echinoderms, though it tends to be rather simplified and rudimentary at best. In holothuroids, its basic pattern mirrors that of the water vascular system. There is a hemal ring in the aquapharyngeal bulb, which connects to radial hemal sinuses. These are essentially similar to major blood vessels, and even have contractile actions in some species. 2 of these sinuses in particular are closely associated with the sea cucumber's gut. The so-called dorsal sinus and ventral sinus connect to the gut and ultimately one another by a series of finely branched blood vessels. This suggests a function in nutrient distribution, likely carried out at least in part by the resident coelomocytes. At the back of the gut, one can find a chamber commonly known as the cloaca. This chamber is associated with several distinct cloacal muscles that extend from the gut wall to the surrounding body wall. When these muscles contract, they are able to expand the cloaca and draw in seawater from the outside. One might ask why the sea cucumber would want to do this. Simply put, the reason is respiration. 2 respiratory trees arise from the cloaca, extending forward into the coelomic cavity. These trees are finely branched and subdivided, with relatively thin and delicate walls, perfect for gas exchange. To further facilitate this process, the left tree tends to be associated with the hemal system and tied up with a dense network of blood vessels known as a rete mirabile. This is Latin for wondrous net, and it is a term that is also applied to a number of especially dense and complicated circulatory structures seen in various vertebrates. These structures are not directly related to those of the sea cucumbers. In any case, the cloacal muscles allow the sea cucumber to effectively breathe. It is worth noting that no other group of echinoderms has anything approaching a respiratory tree internally. Both of the respiratory and circulatory systems are at their most complicated within the holothuroidea, at least so far as echinoderms are concerned. So how does this surprisingly complicated anatomy develop? Here again, we see a curious divergence from most of the other echinoderms. The common pattern is a planktonic larval stage with bilateral symmetry, which eventually develops a rudiment. In other words, a sort of growth that seems at first like an anomalous little tumor, at least until this shapeless lump begins to develop structures like tube feet and internal ossicles. The original larval body is eventually discarded one way or another, and this rudiment goes on to develop into the juvenile echinoderm body. Sea cucumbers do not undergo this rather catastrophic form of metamorphosis. Instead, in the majority of cases, the larval body develops more or less directly into the juvenile form through a series of internal and external rearrangements. To begin with, in the vast majority of sea cucumber species, both males and females release their gametes into the seawater at certain times of the year. This can be something of a spectacle in itself, incidentally. The sea cucumber's body typically contains a single gonad, which connects with the outside of the body via a gonopore located a short distance above the mouth. In some species, a spawning sea cucumber will raise the front end of its body into a nearly vertical position before emitting a more or less steady stream of either eggs or sperm into the water. This stream emerges from a point that would be perhaps very roughly analogous to the middle of the forehead, if the sea cucumber could be said to have a head at all. Eventually, when egg meets sperm out in the open ocean, an embryo develops and eventually becomes a tiny planktonic larva. The first larval stage in most sea cucumbers is known as an auricularia, and it is a fairly standard bilateral echinoderm larva. It vaguely resembles the bipinnaria larva seen in the majority of sea star species. A sinuous band of cilia wraps around the little creature's body, granting it the means to move and feed in open water. In time, this rather ornate little larval form transforms into a more simplified, barrel-shaped creature known as a doliolaria. The single twisting band of cilia breaks up and rearranges into 5 circular cilia bands wrapped around the tiny barrel body. Overall, this form strongly resembles that of the typical crinoid larva, and as it happens, the crinoids are the only other echinoderms that undergo a more or less direct larval metamorphosis. It would also appear that, at least in some species, the doliolaria does not feed. In time, the doliolaria changes again into something called a pentactula. As may be guessed by the name, this little creature is distinguished by the presence of 5 tentacles around its mouth. It is around this time that the larva settles onto the sea floor and develops at last into a juvenile sea cucumber. As unusual as this metamorphosis is, there are a few species that dispense with metamorphosis altogether. Instead of releasing eggs, the female retains them after fertilization. Such brooding sea cucumbers might keep the developing offspring in their tentacles or a specialized pouch. The more extreme brooders keep their offspring safe within the coelomic cavity of their bodies. When the juveniles are fully developed, they exit their mother through a rupture in her body wall. Thankfully, the usual echinoderm capacity for regeneration applies to sea cucumbers, so such an injury is not especially troublesome to the new parent. Regardless of the finer details of their development, sea cucumbers tend to occupy just a few basic sorts of ecological niches. Broadly speaking, they are either suspension feeders or substrate feeders. That is, they either filter food out of the seawater, or else they dine upon the dirt. These 2 general approaches to eating are reflected in a few basic sorts of feeding tentacles. In suspension feeders, the tentacles tend to be finely branched and coated with a thin layer of adhesive mucus. Bits of drifting detritus are trapped and held in place until the sea cucumber eventually brings the tentacle into its mouth. It then slowly extracts the tentacle again, removing much of the trapped plankton in the process. It is perhaps a bit reminiscent of a somewhat informal person employing their mouth to remove residual sauce from their fingers as they dine upon a plate of ribs or chicken wings. The feeding sea cucumber simply brings each tentacle into its mouth one at a time, continually extracting whatever might have been captured from the water. With substrate feeders, the process is quite similar. In the worm-like apodid sea cucumbers, the feeding tentacles are rather feathery, and they are brushed against a surface before being brought to the mouth. In many of the more standard sea cucumbers, the tentacles consist of a sturdy stalk with a sort of flattened disc at the end, made up of myriad little branches. These are pressed to the underlying sea floor and pick up sand and silt to bring to the mouth. Rather importantly, there is more than merely sand on a typical seabed. There is organic material available, whether it is detritus or bacteria or algae or even tiny invertebrates. Whatever it might be, it is digested and extracted in the sea cucumber's digestive system, leaving mainly mineral particles and a bit of mucus to exit at the other end. In this regard, the substrate-feeding sea cucumbers are a bit like autonomous vacuum cleaners that patrol the sea floor and regularly clean the sand off. In certain parts of the deeper ocean, they may be found in surprisingly large numbers. It has been said by some marine biologists that every grain of sand in the sea has at one time or another passed through a sea cucumber. I am inclined to believe this, even if it might somewhat alter the aesthetic of typical sandy beaches. While food is a vital part of a sea cucumber's life, as with any other animal, there is another related concern. In the majority of cases, just as animals must eat to survive, so also they must avoid being eaten. This might seem to be an especially pressing concern for sea cucumbers, as they are not especially mobile. Indeed, most move at the usual slow echinoderm speeds. They lack the armor and spines seen in so many of their relatives. They are even lacking in specialized sensory organs for the most part. A few species have some rather simple eye spots near the base of their tentacles, but most are effectively blind and reliant upon diffuse senses of general light levels, touch, taste, and smell to perceive their surroundings. However, they are not without their defenses. To begin with, there is the rather simple defense of hiding away, particularly during the day. A number of holothuroid species only appear out in the open at night to graze on whatever substrate they can get at. Despite their relative lack of senses, they can be quite effective at hiding. In more sandy environments, a sea cucumber may simply burrow to get out of sight. Some species of suspension feeders spend most of their time burrowed, poking their tentacles out into the water to catch whatever might happen to drift by. In more rocky environments, the sea cucumbers have a surprising advantage. Like other echinoderms, they possess mutable collagenous tissue. In other words, with the right neural signals, they can modify the physical properties of the connective tissue in their bodies. This allows some species to very nearly liquefy, at least on a temporary basis. This makes it relatively simple for them to squeeze their way into secluded gaps between large boulders or convoluted coral formations. A variation of this approach is seen in the large species Holothuria thomasi, sometimes called the tiger tail sea cucumber. This particular creature keeps its posterior end anchored in a suitably tight space and sweeps its fairly lengthy body slowly over the surrounding sea floor, ingesting whatever detritus it is able to reach. The mutable collagenous tissue of sea cucumbers also allows them to easily practice various forms of autotomy, the process of literally breaking their own bodies apart. Some of the vermiform apodid varieties can simply bisect their own bodies with a transverse break, leaving a front portion and a back portion. If both of these fragments survive, each can regenerate to form a complete sea cucumber. A somewhat more sophisticated form of autotomy is seen in the process of evisceration. Evisceration literally means the removal of the viscera, or guts. This is, of course, lethal to most animals. To many species of sea cucumber, it is merely a temporary inconvenience. Some species will sever their digestive tract in such a way that it is expelled from the posterior end. Others use the front of the body as a convenient exit for their erstwhile organs. Many of these will go so far as to sever and eject the feeding tentacles along with internal viscera. Eventually, the lost organs are replaced by regeneration. One might ask just how a sea cucumber is able to regenerate much of anything when its primary means of obtaining nutrition has literally been ripped away. As it turns out, many sea cucumbers can simply metabolize their own tissues as they replace lost anatomy. The end result is a smaller creature, but one that is at least intact. In a few genera, notably Bohadsia, Pseudocolochirus, and Holothuria, this evisceration is somewhat more selective and refined. It is worth noting that Bohadsia in particular has a species with quite remarkable warning coloration. Bohadsia argus is commonly known as the leopard sea cucumber and has a distinctive spotted pattern. Meanwhile, Bohadsia ocellatus has a similar sort of overall pattern and is commonly called the polka-dotted sea cucumber. With such bold patterning, one should expect an especially vicious defensive system. In these particular holothuroid genera, there are a series of internal tubules arising from the gut, quite close to the respiratory trees and extending out into the coelomic cavity. In this state, they are largely inert. That is, until the sea cucumber is sufficiently agitated. A few strong muscle contractions, and a proper loosening of key points of connective tissue, and the gut wall is ruptured. These tubules, known as Cuvierian tubules, are then pushed out through the posterior orifice. Now, the sudden emergence of what looks like a nest of translucent white worms from a sea cucumber's hindquarters can be unnerving enough to begin with. However, this is merely the beginning of the trouble. As these tubules are biochemically activated, they become remarkably adhesive. They also expand to several times their original size. They readily break away, sticking to whatever potential predator has perturbed the sea cucumber. Incidentally, they are also highly toxic. Saponins are a class of large, complex molecules found in many sea cucumber species. The Cuvierian tubules are filled with these poisonous saponins. In other species, these toxins are more generally distributed within the body wall or the outer skin. While the precise toxicity of different saponins may vary, there is an overall tendency towards an extremely unpalatable, bitter sort of flavor. It is a taste reminiscent of a bar of soap, and the word saponin is derived from the Latin term for soap. Even so, not all sea cucumber species are equally toxic. Quite a few are edible by human standards, and some are even sought after as expensive cuisine in certain parts of the world. Still, humans are by no means the only consumers of these echinoderms. Some of their most menacing enemies are snails, oddly enough. One example is Tona gallia, a particularly large species of carnivorous snail found in the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the North Atlantic. This snail has a pair of proboscises which it uses to envelop its prey. Its preferred food seems to be sea cucumbers, though it is by no means a picky eater. A great many other echinoderms are also on its menu, along with a number of crustaceans, bivalves, and fish. A large predatory snail is troublesome enough, but there is an entire family of snails that take a decidedly more subtle approach to dining on sea cucumbers. The Eulimidae are a rather large family of small parasitic snails that live on various echinoderms. Many of the species live as ectoparasites, clinging to the skin of their host and inserting a proboscis to imbibe coelomic fluid. Their shells tend to be narrow and pointed, and rather smooth, making them relatively difficult to grasp or dislodge. Many also tend to take on the color of their host, blending in with relative ease. Some eulimids go further, embedding themselves in the echinoderm's skin to some degree. A few genera go so far as to become internal parasites. One example of this is the genus Ecological. These creatures are only recognizable as snails because of their larval stage. The tiny larva has a fairly typical little shell, and it creeps along the ocean floor. One way or the other, it gains entry into a sea cucumber's digestive tract. When it reaches the intestine, it embeds itself and undergoes a radical metamorphosis. The shell is lost, along with virtually all of the rest of the typical mollusk anatomy. What remains, in the case of a female snail at least, is a tube attached to the intestine and dangling out into the surrounding coelomic cavity. The males of this genus undergo an even more extensive metamorphosis. They effectively enter and fuse with the females, becoming little more than sperm-producing organs. Meanwhile, the tubular female is not much more than an egg-producing organ at this point. Such is often the case with the more extreme endoparasites, an overdevelopment of the gonads at the expense of virtually all other tissues. The eggs are simply shed into the lumen of the intestine and find their way out of the sea cucumber by the usual route. A new generation of larval snails arises, and the cycle repeats. Still, the sea cucumbers parasitized by these particular snails do have an effective remedy for this situation, even if it is somewhat extreme. Every year, around the end of summer, these particular holothoroids eviscerate themselves as a matter of normal procedure. Such an annual evisceration is not at all uncommon among sea cucumbers. It may be regarded as a somewhat extreme form of spring cleaning. While this removes the Ecological parasites, there is another related genus of eulimid snails that might actually benefit from these annual eviscerations. The genus Enteroxenos has a very similar life history to Ecological, with one key difference. They do not remain attached to the intestinal wall as they mature. Instead, these little parasites break away to float freely within the coelomic cavity. Their eggs can only leave the sea cucumber during its annual evisceration. Even as the discarded organs and ejected parasites decay and dissolve away, the egg capsules mature to eventually hatch into larval snails. To return to sea cucumbers, there is at least one group that resorts to a rather atypical form of defense. Solus chitinoides is commonly known as the slipper sea cucumber. It is also known as the armored sea cucumber. The usual embedded ossicles are developed into a series of tough scales in this species. Meanwhile, the flat underside is well equipped with an impressive array of tube feet. These allow for some degree of fairly slow mobility. More importantly, they allow this creature to hang on to any rocky surface with remarkable tenacity. This creature often remains immobile for prolonged periods of time. This is no great issue, as it is a suspension feeder. When it feeds, 10 bright orange tentacles are extended into the water. These tentacles are particularly large and extensively branched. They are also fairly delicate, and so tend to be withdrawn at the first sign of trouble. In addition to its overlapping scales, the tissues of this creature contain a relatively high concentration of saponins. Most predators leave this particular sea cucumber alone, though the local sea stars will still dine upon it from time to time. While the sea cucumbers found in shallower waters can be quite interesting and unusual, one must go into deeper waters to find the truly bizarre species. One of the more spectral forms is a curious little creature known as Oneirophanta mutabilis. The name translates roughly into a shifting vision from a dream. It is a translucent sea cucumber with a number of long, thin papillae down its back. Certainly, it looks as though it could have wandered in from an especially disturbing dream. Some of the more famous deep-sea holothoroids are in the genus Scotoplanes. These are commonly called sea pigs and sometimes sea cows. The reasons for such fanciful names might not be immediately apparent. These holothoroids are bizarre, even by sea cucumber standards. They are translucent, as are many invertebrates in the deep sea. They also tend to have a pinkish hue. Instead of the usual legion of tiny tube feet on the underside, they have relatively few large podia that they wander about on. Their feeding tentacles are actually a little on the small side compared to these particular podia. This makes a degree of sense though, as these creatures tend to traverse expanses of very soft sediment as they wander the abyssal plane. The large elongated podia prevent them from getting mired down in the muck. Many species also have similarly large papillae on their backs, though the function of such structures is perhaps less clear. The sea pigs are remarkably common in the deep sea, and they can often be found moving in groups. The sight is somewhat reminiscent of a herd of cattle, or perhaps a drove of pigs, grazing on a grassy prairie. Of course, grass is in somewhat short supply at the bottom of the sea, but these creatures are still grazers after a fashion. They collect the steady supply of detritus that tends to drift down from shallower, more productive waters. This combination of dead plankton, droppings, and other organic material is commonly known as marine snow, a whimsical name for a somewhat less than appealing substance. Still, for the sea pigs, it is a vital food source that allows them to exist in prodigious numbers. These oddly charming echinoderms are in the order Elassipodidae. Another genus in this order is Enypniastes, with the single known species Enypniastes eximia. This creature lives in a manner not unlike that of the sea pigs, feeding on sediment at the bottom of the deep ocean. However, there is one rather significant difference. This sea cucumber can swim. The swimming is accomplished by a pair of structures sometimes referred to as veils. Each veil extends outward from the robust barrel-shaped body in an approximation of a semicircle. The smaller veil is near the back, while the larger one is at the front, just behind the feeding tentacles. In each of these structures, a row of large papillae support a span of webbing. These veils can be moved in a manner not unlike the bell of a jellyfish, propelling the sea cucumber through the water at a languid pace. The body is held almost vertically as it swims, with the mouth more or less facing upwards and the feeding tentacles retracted. This spectacle is made all the more unusual by the translucency of the creature's body and its deep pink hue. It is also bioluminescent under certain circumstances. All of these features taken together would go some ways towards explaining some of the common names for this rather singular species. One such name is the Spanish dancer. This is perhaps a commentary on the grace of the creature as it slowly makes its way through the water. A distinctly less flattering name is the headless chicken monster. No doubt this is more of a commentary on the unique body structure. While Enypniastes is rather impressive in its way, there is a close relative that is an even more proficient swimmer. This species, Pelagothuria natatrix, is the only known species in its genus as well. It has a translucent body with a faint purple hue. It also has a veil towards the front of its body, just behind the feeding tentacles. However, this veil is quite large and extends outwards on all sides of the sea cucumber. There is only a small gap on the ventral side of the body. Behind this veil, the body is roughly conical, extending back to a blunt point. Or perhaps it is better to say the relatively small body hangs beneath the veil, tapering downward to a blunt point. No other podia are readily apparent. The only appendages are the ring of feeding tentacles and the podia within the large veil. Unlike its close relative, Pelagothuria never rests on the sea floor. It spends all of its life drifting in the vast abyss of the deep sea, feeding on whatever it can pull from the surrounding water. It would seem that holothuroids are defined by their oddity. Being echinoderms, they are quite different to most other animal life to begin with. This class goes further still, defying many of the conventions of most other echinoderms. Beyond even this, there are a number of species that are quite unusual and atypical, even for sea cucumbers. Despite their humble habits and unassuming ways, these creatures may easily be considered to be among the very strangest forms of animal life. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed today's little foray into the unknown. If you are still curious and wish to venture a little further, here are a few things you might consider looking into. If you found this video enjoyable, do feel free to leave a like. If you believe others might enjoy it, by all means, share. If you wish to see more of this channel, a subscription should prove quite helpful. Until next time.